And begin the Q&A session. But before we begin, I have a new face to introduce that you haven't seen yet. Karen Dietz is Manager of Portfolio Management with GDF Suez Energy Resources. And her main responsibility is for managing our portfolio in MISO. And so she is responsible for hedging and setting pricing and price curves for our load and our customers here in the Midwest ISO. She has about 10 years experience in managing energy.
Pretty close.
Pretty close, okay. The past 6 with GDF Suez, and before that working with Entergy. So, and she's a graduate of the University of Texas, if I'm not mistaken. Yes, okay,
Yep.
Good. So let's open it first to questions from the floor. I do have a couple that have been planted. Jeffrey?
It's such a good panel, I can't pass up the opportunity. I'm going to direct this to Ron. It's about MISO. Chairman, feel free to comment afterwards. Sure. It's going to sound like I'm taking a shot at MISO, because I am. You mentioned in your presentation, I really appreciated, the energy price sending a signal. And you're really talking about supply and demand. And what you're trying to talk about is MISO saying to potential developers of generation, here's the price you're going to get per unit when you sell, after you build, after you invest. It's enough to get you to come in and build the resources that we think we need to exceed our peak. And the capacity market, which you said, pointed out as resource adequacy part, was beyond energy, and it too is a signal of, another revenue stream that a new generator on the supply side would get. And from the retail perspective, you don't want that signal to be so rich that the retail user has to pay for it, but you understand that there's a balance of supply and demand, and if there's scarcity in a certain pocket, well, you're going to have to pay a little bit more, and maybe the result will be a new resource arrives, and then it goes down later, supply and demand. There's something about the way MISO's doing things that does not seem to be sending an adequate signal. And from what I know, because I have to cover the states east of here, which are in the PJM, as you mentioned, footprint, generators in MISO don't make enough money in MISO and want to get into the PJM market. People in PJM complain that they're paying too much, but generators want to go there because they will get paid more. And it seems like we have not figured this out yet, because I'm not advocating for higher prices in MISO. I don't think anybody here would want that. But at the same time, at some point, the signal is not going to be sent, and the investment in transmission, you mentioned $5 billion plus over just the next 5 years, which is a short horizon, will create a deliverable market, but not one that has a lot of generation, because that generation is going to want to go to another area. So I'm just curious, again, is MISO doing it right? Are prices supposed to be higher? Is the price right? Is PJM doing it right? Are prices too high there? In the end, what is a customer to expect from all the pricing elements they have to see in a bill? And are they in a good time, but it's an unrealistic time? The prices should go up. I'm just curious about that.
Can I have an easier question? No. I think let me start off the first part. I mentioned how the MISO market's evolving. I don't think it's met its end state yet. And I think the markets are still trying to find whatever that sweet spot is. But I did mention, too, it's voluntary membership. And in MISO, most of your states that are involved are the vertically integrated type of states. They're the regulated states. Illinois happens to be one. Michigan has a small amount of retail choice in its area, but Illinois tends to be the largest one with that. That tends to take you down the road of how do you want your market design and what kind of signals do you need. In a regulated state, they don't need as many signals because many of that has been done vertically, right? They've taken care of that and they're working with their commissions. So it's a question of, okay, so then what is that really enough though, because it doesn't serve the needs completely of Illinois, but it does serve the needs of some others. And I think that's the balance that really necessitates that. Now PJM, on the other hand, PJM has a lot of states that have retail choice. And so their signals are a little bit stronger from a perspective of saying, we need something more to incent some other aspects of that market. But then it gets also to a question of what type of market do you want? Do you want to have a market that is energy only, meaning it focuses on the prices today and it gives you those price signals today? Or do I want to pay for capacity in the future? And so I'm going to, if you will, lower a little bit of the energy cost because I'm going to make sure I procure something in the forward market. And I think those markets are still really kind of evolving to find the right mix of that. I will agree there's sometimes the thought of the grass is greener on the other side by going from MISO to PJM. And I think there is going to be quite a bit of resources that will try to make that leap. And MISO has been concerned about whether or not that does start to cause a resource adequacy issue in the future. Even to the chairman's point of saying some of the environmental regulations, that could bring a significant amount of retirements, probably around the 2015-16 timeframe, that could also impact that. But again, those regulated utilities don't need as strong of a price signal as maybe some of the others. Does that somewhat answer it, Chairman Allen?
Yeah, and I completely agree with that, and kind of the point I was making earlier, when we look at it here in a competitive state, in what's that mix going to be? What's the incentive for people to do that? Well, the incentive in the PJM market, as Ron said, is a little bit higher, and as the question pointed out, because the incentives seem to be a little bit better there, and it isn't so much of an issue in the rest of the MISO territory because they're rate basing most of that generation and they're getting their money back, and so the incentive is there for them to be able to build the power plants there. We just happen to be an anomaly because we're a competitive state that's also in MISO, and so those same market signals don't necessarily work here because nobody's rate basing power here in Illinois. The other thing to add to that is that there's a lot of discussion between MISO and PJM about how easily power flows from MISO to PJM. Obviously, the people who generate power in PJM are not wonderfully excited about having a lot more generation come into their market because that affects their pricing system and those incentives and those price signals that you talked about. At the same time, one of the things that we talk to MISO about frequently is kind of the mixed message of telling us on the one hand that it's really important, and it's really important for certain of the companies who are MISO companies, power generators. It's really important for them to be able to sell power into PJM, but on the other hand, tell us sometimes in the same conversation how worried they are about capacity going forward because of coal retirements and other issues. And we're like, well, you can't really have it both ways. You can't tell us you've got concerns about capacity and then tell us, but you're really actively trying to get more power to move out of MISO and into the PJM territory. So those are obviously very complicated, but things that we're trying to work with them as well and find out how best we fit also.
Right, and to that end, though, if you looked at one of Ron's slides, it showed, I think, 132,000 megawatts of generation in MISO and about 96,000 megawatts of load at peak.
Right.
So that's a very wide reserve margin, effectively. Whereas in PJM, you have a much narrower reserve margin. I can't quote what that is off the top of my head, but I think it's much tighter, maybe 15 to 20%, whereas Midwest ISO is closer to 30%. That alone should be a driver for those market prices. Because there's so much excess generation in MISO, that should depress those capacity prices, should they not?
Partially, but the two markets, both MISO and PJM, both evolved completely differently.
Sure, absolutely.
And so PJM's price signals, they have, how would I put it, some various different aspects that help to kind of create a price that they think is helpful in that region. In MISO, again, if you have a lot of the regulated generation and some excess, that excess is not going to offer into the market at what would they're not having to recover all of their cost, so their prices are going to be much lower.
Right.
And so I think there is some aspects of suppression that you see at times Again, it's more because of, I think, the way the market footprint and the design that has happened over the years.
Well, and is that to a great extent because a lot of that generation, that excess generation is not in a competitive market, but rather
Right.
behind utilities that are vertically integrated.
That's exactly
In
my
fact,
point, yes.
I think 96% of the generation didn't even bid in, right? Am I saying that correctly? It was 96% of the generation were self-serving utilities.
That's right.
Which meant only 4% went to set that price.
Yes.
Does that alone create issues from a competitive standpoint or the long-term market design standpoint? If only 4% of the generation even participates in this capacity auction, is it a good auction?
Well, this is the first year of that auction, and so I really do think it's going to evolve from here. I think this was their first step or first foray into it. I think there's a lot of lessons that we'll all learn from that and determining whether or not it is setting that signal appropriately. And the key is going to be, I think, and Illinois is the one that feels this a little bit more, I think, because of what we talked about and the way they're situated. But I think some of the other utilities will also be caught into some aspects of saying, I've got to retire these units. When I retire them, is that going to put me into the market, or am I going to build generation? And if it's going to put them into the market, how's that interaction going to play? And the other point that was brought up by the chairman, that MISO is saying in one hand that going forward with all these retirements, there's going to be a lot in 2015-16. The current construct only looks out 1 year, so it only looks out from May 2013 to 2014. And some would say, well, is it missing the window because you shouldn't be looking out further than that? And so I think a lot of those questions are things that are being tackled, and it's unfortunate. I think there's going to be an evolving design there.
They're also MISO's looking at those reserve margins dropping fairly substantially over time also
That's
as
Right,
the
there's retirements coming.
as the
Right.
retirements kick in.
Well, then wind causes problems with that as well.
Well, wind creates a specific problem, here for us. You've probably read about that. The specific problem for the nuclear plants,
right.
because the nuclear plants are essentially selling power at night at negative
Right.
price. They're essentially paying to run their nuclear plants at night instead of getting compensated for the power, because that's when the wind comes into the system. And the nuclear plants don't have the ability that certain gas plants would have or other generation. They don't shut down, so that they're going to keep running, and that creates for Exelon, for example, that creates a huge issue.
It's great for customers, though. If they're in the real-time pricing.
It's great for customers on
Get paid to
real-time
run off
pricing.
the,
Absolutely.
In the back, Brett?
In the short term, anyway. There are several, obviously. One is, and I just spent a couple days in Atlanta last month with a bunch of regulators, consumer advocates, and regulated utilities talking about this very issue, about bringing DG on, what are the issues for it. And I touched on a couple of them when I was talking, mostly about, what's the backup plan if that doesn't work, and you've got a whole bunch of sunk costs that are out there for this system that we designed well over 100 years ago, that we're still making sure it gets maintained or even upgraded, as we were talking about with the transmission projects. How does distributed generation coming in a major way, not where it is at the levels that it is now, but coming in a place where you'd like to see it, and actually there are a lot of good reasons for it to come in a major way, but what does that do to that system, and how much are ratepayers generally going to pay for? Who pays for that? How are the costs allocated amongst all of the ratepayers, or what is a backup system that's out there? What are the regulations? Do we have the appropriate regulations here in the state to do that? Probably need some upgrading in those as well. And then a lot of other issues, just in terms of even the agreeing on the definitions of what it is. What kind of power is it? Do you also bring in another public policy issue with we've just gone through it on a national level, and we'll probably continue to do it, about the backup generators perhaps being environmentally, in many cases, worse than the power that is being displaced. And a lot of the reason people like distributed generation is because it relies a lot on renewables in many cases, or on another process that you're already doing, like a CHP kind of process. Well, if your backup is some kind of diesel, oil, burn spotted owls, whatever it is, something that may have some environmental problems that may be greater than whatever power you're displacing, that creates some issues as well. I mean, those are just a couple off the top. Doesn't mean that it can't be done, and it doesn't mean that people like me don't think that that's something that that can have great benefits if you move to it. It's just trying to overlay that onto a system that's developed with cost allocations that have developed over well over 100 years. That's not an easy thing to do overnight.
If I can.
Please.
Sure.
Not to point counterpoint, but I think the best investment over the last 10 years might have been a utility company. And as you look at the utility company return on what they've got, and the conversation of sunk cost, I think is really an old argument, that they got that sunk cost paid for, and the Illinois utility companies were a great investment when they had the freeze. Because the moment it turned, everything went. And if you invested money in ComEd and Ameren before, you did very well with how they've come out of it.
Yeah.
I don't know, you were going to say, Ron, I don't know.
And I'll just respond to that briefly. Obviously, our difficulties from a commission standpoint with some of the incumbent utilities in the state's been fairly well documented, so I don't have to go through that again. And this whole Modernization Act that passed through the legislature, you're talking about all of those issues as well, but a lot of the issue becomes what's the reliability of the system. Going back to Ron's slides, the reliability, not just from a transmission standpoint, but from a distribution standpoint, is huge. And so the incredible amount of investment that goes into that. I mean, we're talking about, literally billions of dollars over 10 years here between ComEd and Ameren to upgrade their distribution system and to make it better in terms of fewer outages that a more steeled system to be able to do that. Well, distributed generation threatens that model, right? So I mean, and obviously the legislature was of a mind to kind of go all in on the grid modernization and stealing. So kind of overlaying DG on top of that, when that's the mindset down the street, is a little bit difficult too. And I'm not disagreeing with you at all. I'm just saying, I'm just kind of laying out what the political realities of it are.
Ron, any comment?
The only one I would mention is that in some markets you do see distributed generation being utilized. And for example, in PJM, I was mentioning before the historical generation resources, but demand response has really been something that's picked up in PJM. They saw the price signal, if you will, and said, I can actually bring a response to that better than the generators can at a cheaper price. So demand response really came into droves in that area. Some of that is behind the meter type generation or energy efficiency programs, all these different aspects. And in MISO, we haven't really seen that take hold from a MISO-wide. Most of them have been mostly within the states or within the utilities. So I think there's still a lot of growth that has to happen, or maybe the market design might need to evolve to help that. So I think there's a couple of areas that maybe doesn't make it as fertile ground, but we are seeing some of that in, I think, in PJM and maybe some other markets.
If I may just continue with one thing you asked,
Sure.
if I would share my view.
Yeah, please.
And I just wanted to ask you if this is on the radar scope of the ICC, because this is, I think, when I listen to some costs and paper backup, I listen to that as a utility conversation, more of a marketing conversation. It is really technically challenging, because we can overcome a lot of the interface and the
Right.
interconnecting challenges and shut off power and control the flow of power in a way that protects workers and protects the grid effectively. So there's two areas that I've been seeing, and I think are the two areas I think are the biggest drivers, and I'd like your opinion on this, and that is private wires and public thoroughfares. So we've been involved in a variety of cogeneration opportunities where at the end of a distribution line, where a particular one here up in the Chicagoland area, where a facility was at the end of the distribution line, and because they wanted to put in a cogen system, they would end up to size it right with that excess electricity generation just coming. And they had a neighbor across the public street who was also experiencing electrical problems at the end of this line, and was very interested in buying the excess electricity. But that would require them to build a private wire across the public thoroughfare to deal with stuff. Done. And now you have two customers, that the ComEd has two customers in their line who are completely dissatisfied. And because of those two rules, no private wires, no public thoroughfare, And the company who wanted to invest in that cogen system was willing to put the private wire in. And they made the investments and were willing to do it under the public thoroughfare. Those two rules killed the deal. And I have two customers who are dissatisfied with electricity service at the end of the line. So my view is those two are the key rules.
Yeah, and you're gonna need,
Those two rules get changed, and distributed generation and cogeneration, and the proper regulatory framework to protect that the distributed wires and the public thoroughfare get protected correctly, have to
Right.
be in place, of course. But if those two rules were negated, I think we'd see an explosion in distributed generation, we'd see a drop in cost, the emissions conversation is controllable locally, and I think it would be beneficial to everybody across the board. So I think those are the two rules. So is the ICC looking at those two rules at all? And is there any conversation of ending those two?
well, we're looking at the issue, the short answer to your question is, yes, we're looking at this issue in general and all of the different components that come with that. The longer answer, in a lot of cases, involves legislation, and not just things that we can control. So, in the last legislative session, there was a kind of a Christmas tree bill that talked about all kinds of different energy-related things, not the big Energy Modernization Act, but there was a different bill that was going around that had a lot of pieces that would have facilitated better distributed generation, augmented, more distributed generation in the state. Didn't pass. But yeah, so those, unfortunately, much as I would love to have complete control over everything, I don't, so, which is probably better in the long run for everybody. But those are the kinds of things that are going to need, not just us, they're going to need the folks down the street. Thanks.
Question?
Chairman Scott, speaking of your control over everything,
Yeah.
what would the Illinois Commerce Commission position be if Ameren were to move forward and formally request to have their service territory declared competitive as it was defined under the deregulation bill enacted 15 years ago? And all future retail energy prices would essentially be market-based, like natural gas is, to the retail consumer.
We did not plant that question.
Yeah, yeah.
Do you think that the market has evolved to the point where the Commerce Commission could realistically step back and say the market is the best determinant of the price and not the Commerce Commission? Of the price of energy, not
Price,
distribution.
right.
all the rest.
Unfortunately, I've tried to be pretty good about doing what I could and answering things. That's what I'm going to have to dodge away from a little bit for a couple reasons. One is we go out of our way to try to not take positions on things that may end up coming before us at some point, and that's obviously one. And Nicole over at the table has a taser that she's going to hit me with if I violate that rule. And the second part of it is, commission, I'm first among equals, so there are 5 of us, and it takes 3 of us to do anything, and I don't know the position of the other commissioners on that, so I couldn't even hazard a guess as to what that would be. We also have 2 brand-new commissioners, too,
Can I suggest maybe we can talk around it in an interesting way?
Okay, sure.
There are some rules about thresholds that have to
Mm-hmm.
be crossed. Maybe you could speak to what the thresholds are. And then it is the utility's voluntary request.
Correct.
So if you understood the rules and you knew that it was the utility that would have to bring it, then you could call your utility.
Right.
It's about
Yeah.
33% over
Yeah.
4 suppliers, something like that?
They're passed. Now, I mean, in terms of the thresholds, they're there, but it's the question of the voluntary request, so.
The utility has to make the case.
Right. And that would definitely be something that then would come to us as well. So that's why I have to be a little more guarded about what I say.
As a consumer, I'm not in the business of this. My concern is that the market today has unbelievably cheap prices.
Right.
Probably too cheap of prices to be sustainable. But if the Commerce Commission's oversight is removed because of this current market low price, and then 2 years, 5 years, 7 years from now, the market has upward price It's gonna go up one of these days. So that was the point.
And the interesting thing about that is that we also have to keep in mind, and we've touched on it a bunch of times this morning already, is that, you know, we don't make one set of rules and then just leave them in place either. Obviously, we did the competition law, and as I mentioned, when the caps came off, you know, all heck broke loose, and there were all of a sudden a new set of requirements and a new set of laws, and I mean, that's the system, and so that's the way it is, but it's always going to be very responsive to whatever's going on at the time, and so something that we plan for today may not get the same legislative response or the same public response 5 years from now when changes start to take effect as a result of that plan.
Right, yeah. To your point, there's a whole political backstop behind all of this, right? As the switching in the residential end has really occurred in this state by and large due to municipal aggregation. And we saw some very aggressive municipal aggregation prices over the
Right.
past couple of years, and that's facilitated this high switch rate. But now,
Purchase of receivables and
yeah,
a couple of other.
there's some great market improvements
Right.
that the commission has put in place that's really helped that, purchase of receivables and others. But and the market Office of Market Development, I think, has been a great contributor to that. But what we just saw with ComEd and I think with Ameren, that their standard offer prices came down significantly for the coming plan year starting next month. Some of those aggregation prices are no longer cheaper than the utility alternative. And so now there are some towns in the Chicago area that are concerned politically about what's the ramifications of that. They did a great deal last year at 5.6 cents a kilowatt hour. Well, now ComEd's 5.5. So what does that mean for their ratepayers and their voters in that town? I think that's something that's going to play out over time. So I'm not sure the utilities are quite ready to come to the ICC and ask for that at this point until they get that.
Right.
Add to that, I thought your question was very provocative.
You gotta hit us with something and jump in.
If the market price of electricity goes up in whatever cycles it doesn't mean the regulated utility model is free from that market force. A generating resource is a generating resource, and if the inputs that drive the price of electricity up are the fuel that goes in, or transmission constraints, or the copper and the cement that prices are going up because it's all going to China, whatever it is, it affects all generators. The only difference might be that the regulated utility model might cap what the customer sees immediately, but provide for some kind of recovery mechanism that's deferred. But ultimately, energy costs what energy costs. And if the market price is going up and a utility regulated structure isn't, I can almost guarantee you that that difference is going to be paid for by consumers through a different line item called a PEA, or some adjustment, some reconciliation, because utilities are allowed to recover prudently incurred costs. So I don't know if one model structure or another protects customers from the truly global price of energy. It just may be presented differently and at a different timeline, but I believe ultimately everyone, in whatever the model is, whether it be Wisconsin or Illinois, pays for the price of energy.
Let me add something to that, because I think it's a key point. If I was to go ahead and look in a state, let's say Missouri, since it's close by, and the utility there, and I said, okay, how much am I paying for capacity in Missouri? I don't really know. I don't know what that number is. Now, if I told every utility, all you're going to get is that $1.05 a megawatt day, they would be crying. They would say, oh no, I don't know if I'm going to be able to make it this year. And so I think some of that is transparency, is being able to really get a view into some of those pricing components. And as Retail Choice has kind of done that, it's done that aspect to some degree of giving more transparency to the market and then giving that market choices in which to choose from to make those appropriate based on looking at the value of what they're getting. But I have found it surprising because someone said, oh, well, $1.05, that's low. There's not many utilities that could actually make it on that kind of a price point. So, but if I asked each state and each utility, I don't know how much their capacity costs that they're passing through.
Can I ask a question, Ron? A lot of transmission is allocated to end-use consumers, transmission expansion investment on a beneficiary pays concept. With the $5 billion you were talking about over the next 3 to 5 years, and I think you said $1 billion roughly for the Illinois area, what can an Ameren consumer expect to see? Are they going to be paying their fair share of $5 billion? Is it just the $1 billion? Is it beneficiary pays? Is it spread over everyone? Because, like you said, suppliers are watching this, but we're watching it so we can educate end-use consumers on, look, there's energy, there's regulation, there are all these ancillars, and then there's transmission, and we're trying to pin it down, and it moves, but it could be here. You know, it's education about understanding that better that I think would be helpful.
Sure, and I'm going to actually ask the chairman to jump in a little bit too, because I think this is it's a key issue. And we were just actually talking before the meeting about Illinois, and you say, okay, 1.2 billion is going to happen. How much is Illinois going to pay? And how much value are they getting? Are they getting all the value that they've been told that it would be? So if a beneficiary pays, beneficiary are getting everything they want. I say it's a highly contested issue. Cost allocation of these large transmission projects and making sure that really those that are benefiting are paying those portions is it's more kind of like an art than it is to actually just say mathematically I can come to a number. So I think we'll still see some flux on that or some change around that because I do think that there's some that are going to feel, well, I'm not getting what I thought I was getting out of this. And really, even time will tell a little bit of how much you will really get or benefit from that. But Chairman, do you have?
Yeah, this has been highly contentious for us, and we've been pretty public in filing things with FERC on behalf of Illinois ratepayers, contesting a lot of the methodology for distributing costs or allocating costs to ratepayers here. And let me just give you a couple of examples that I think hopefully will illustrate it. There was obviously Crawford and Fisk, which were the two coal-fired power plants in Chicago, were on environmental, must get rid of lists for years and years and years, and that finally happened. So the question becomes, well, if you take out two large coal-fired power plants in the city of Chicago, does that hurt the availability of energy for the city? What do we do with that? Well, there's a specific transmission upgrade that was done to account for the fact that those two plants may go away, and so we have to rearrange where we're bringing power from and how we're distributing it to the city. That transmission upgrade, everybody who's in Chicago or a ratepayer there can look at that and say, yeah, okay, that one makes sense. It's a specific project, it's a specific cost for something that may happen that eventually did happen. We had a case in front of the commission not too long ago where there was a power line that was going between a place in Virginia and a place in West Virginia, and Illinois ratepayers are paying 16% of that. Now, that's a really hard thing for me to go out, and I used to be a mayor, so I used to go out and explain really, really challenging things and have people throw things at me. I can't figure out a way to tell people in Illinois how they've got that kind of, and this was large, I mean, it was a lot of money, how they got that kind of benefit out of a line that they're never going to see. I can look at things like some of the MVP projects, some specific ones I can't talk about because they're in front of us, but I can look at things and say, all right, it makes sense to bring, just kind of from a global issue, or wear my old environmental hat and say it makes sense to bring South Dakota wind into the PJM territory, even though it may bypass Illinois and bring it into some other places. I can understand that from kind of a larger global perspective. My charge legally as a commissioner in Illinois is to protect the Illinois ratepayers. And so that whole issue, which you just kind of assumed about beneficiary pays, we've thought has not always been the case. And so that's where a lot of the contention comes from. And even with some of the projects, we've been fairly outspoken on some of the MVP projects that Ron talked about earlier, the MISO projects. We don't necessarily see the same benefit for Illinois ratepayers that MISO projects we're going to have. And the other thing is to think about also, when the nuclear plants were constructed in Illinois, and we have obviously the largest nuclear fleet in the country, But there was a lot of transmission upgrades that happened at that time too. And so there's still people who were around then who will be very quick to tell you that we've already paid for all this transmission once, and we've paid for the transmission that sets Illinois up. Now, that may not always be the case, but it's part of that whole discussion when we talk about any of these transmission projects.
In the back?
Is there any thought that distributed generation might lower the need for that
Sure.
investment in transmission? And is that a calculus that goes on when you're making the decision at the ICC between, do I support more transmission, do I support some other mechanism?
Well, the calculus that goes on, yeah, I mean, the calculus that goes on is not just distributed generation, but are there other ways to achieve what you need to achieve, but rather than just building the transmission line. That's part of the analysis that gets done in terms of what the benefit is versus the cost. But distributed generation can help for not only that, but also for not having the need to build new power plants, right? So I mean, there are lots of which don't necessarily go into the calculus on a transmission decision, but certainly in a broader sense do. But those are again the kinds of things that are arguments that need to be made to the legislature as well as you start looking at it.
One of the things you said, Ron, that I didn't know, it was the generation of Energy and Ameren are both financially in trouble.
Yes.
So it's like, is the central station model broken now? And is the distribution model a better choice? That's what triggered me when you said that. I went, oh, maybe now is really, because of the price angle, because of the driving down the cost, is distribution model really now a better choice?
You know, I think a lot of times too, it's timing of when things happen. I mean, we had an unusual aspect here happen where the downturn in the economy and natural gas prices going where they were, a bit of real crunch, nuclear as well. We actually saw in MISO the first nuclear, and this is an independent power producer, a nuclear unit said, I'm retiring because I cannot get enough money out of this market. So that's significant. But if you would have had all of the same model several years ago when power prices were very good, you may not have had some of the same aspects. So it's a lot about timing and when certain things happen. To one of your points, though, that I think is important, you know, we talk about utilities, how they have an integrated resource plan, where they're to really take all the different aspects of what could fit, right? Is it generation, distributed generation, demand response, energy efficiency? Look at all those pieces. In the MISO market, that really isn't all there. Meaning you don't have everybody being able to play and say, I can do that for cheaper. And now I will just take my pure market view. I would love that kind of market. I think that's exactly where things could end up somewhere down the road. But that would be the case. You'd say, well, who can offer this at the best price for the consumer, right? Is it transmission? Great, then transmission's what we need to do. But if it's distributed generation, does that work? That fits. Or is it really putting in a different power plant in that area that because the need is going to be stronger in the future? All those things, you know, I think need to come to play. They definitely are not there on the MISO market at this time. And I think it's tough, really, to be able to take all those options and say, how do you make sure that they all get a competitive voice at the table?
Is that, before you change your business plan, just to give you more information, the trouble centralized units have or don't have is very fuel specific. So don't just look at it as a ubiquitous, the centralized power plant versus distributed, nuclear, coal, but if you were to talk about combined cycle natural gas, they're exploding. And they're in the queue to come online faster.
Right.
Yeah, let me touch on that. I might be able to help out. You're right, the coal has had, and there's a couple of other reasons for why coal's had that issue. Looking forward, the idea is that natural gas will become a much more of a commodity used to generate power for. Matter of fact, some coal facilities will actually flip over to and switch to gas, considering that the prices for natural gas are there. So you're right, it was very specific on the Dynegy and the Ameren piece being from the coal perspective.
Well, we're running short on time. I don't want to let Karen off the hook without a chance to speak, though. So This week, we've heard an interesting announcement from the Illinois Power Agency regarding the alternative compliance payment. Can you talk about RPS a little bit, kind of fill, we haven't talked much about that. Can you talk about the Illinois RPS a little bit and what's happened
I'll
recently?
let you do that one.
I'm out.
So in all our other states, we can, as an alternative supplier, we can supply meet our RPS obligations by purely buying RECs, either in-state or of a certain type. Illinois is interesting in that 50% of our load has to pay the alternative compliance payment, a rate that's set by the IPA. So we can buy RECs from wind or from Illinois state wind or from a neighboring state to cover 50% of our obligation, but the rest of it we write a check to the state, and so each year we get a max amount that this rate will hit. It can't exceed the maximum rate, and we just found out the maximum rate maybe back in December.
December, yeah.
Yeah, for this coming planning year, for June to May. And as the year proceeds, we get an estimated rate for the current planning year or the next planning year. And normally it's extremely close, probably within a penny of where the estimated rate is and where the actual rate is, or where a previously estimated rate and the new estimated rate is.
A penny a megawatt hour.
A penny a
Right.
megawatt hour, yeah,
very
sorry
well.
guys. This week we got the most recent estimated rate for the 12-13 compliance period,
Which ends in 2 weeks.
which ends at the end of May, and it's an increase for ComEd of 7 cents, and for MISO, for Ameren, it's about 5 cents, 4.5, 5 cents. As a company, we believe it's in the customer's best interest to pass it through, since there's no control that we can have.
Right.
It's completely unhedgeable, and so in order to fix it, there'd be maybe at the max or some kind of art to it. But right now, we've been collecting under collecting for that period, and that's just how it works. But so now we have the new estimated rate that came in, that we will write a check to Illinois in July, and we also got the most estimated rate for 13-14, which actually came down from the max.
But it's up from
quite a
where
bit.
the
But it's
12-13 plan
it's a
year
lot
is
higher than
significant.
any previous year.
Right, right. Yeah, so we've been passing the RPS costs through to our customers, but the challenge we have now is that it's gone up, so we need to figure out how to backtrack and do that. At the same time, we see, and some of you may have seen the article in the Chicago Tribune this past week about that, and about the fact that these funds for the ACP go to the Illinois Power Agency to spend in Illinois on projects, and they've been kind of stymied from being able to spend that money because of aspects of the law. So it's a kind of a challenging and unique issue we have in Illinois around RPS compliance. I don't know if Ron or Chairman Scott, you have anything to comment on
I
it?
just think that the community of suppliers, whether it be GDF Suez Energy or any of the others listed as eligible suppliers, try not to take positions on public policy initiatives. I think you said a lot of these programs are not just about a pure market, they're about other public
Sure.
policy initiatives, whether it be clean air, job creation, an in-state resource like coal, and how to use that. So there's this horrible saying, it is what it is, but it applies. So if the RPS in a state is a certain percentage, we've got to find a way to make the customer know what it is and let them pay it, because ultimately that's what the state's decision was. We want the state's populace to pay for this. And I think Karen was just pointing to the difficulty of when it changes, just keeping customers prepared and educated.
And not knowing what the ultimate fix is going to be, if there is one. I mean, legislature's looking at that right now with a bill that probably, if you had to bet, probably wouldn't pass, certainly in the form that it's in right now. But as we were talking beforehand, never say never with the legislature. It's kind of like zombies. Nothing's ever really dead. So there are people that are working on it actively, alternative suppliers working with the incumbents, with the Attorney General's office, with us, and with others trying to figure out what that fix is going to be. But there's some very different agendas in there too. I mean, if you're a major power producer whose chief source of generation is nuclear, as we talked about earlier, you're not necessarily excited about figuring out ways to unlock the dollars that can go to help subsidize long-term wind projects in the state. And so the legislators really have to figure out, because there is this public policy that says there's a renewable portfolio standard, and because there are specific levels of renewable resources that we have to hit in the fuel mix, and that it gets ratcheted up over time, pretty good conclusion that we're not going to make it with the system the way that it is right now, with some of the constraints that we've got, a lot of which has been brought on by municipal aggregation as well, and a lot more people switching than people anticipated. So that's going to take a legislative fix, and there are different ways to do that. There are a couple that are being debated right now. Not the only ways to do it, and hopefully they'll figure out a way to make it work.
Good.
One thing I'd add to that too is that I think it's hard for retail suppliers to know when they have a volatile rate, what is that rate? How do I make sure I'm collecting the right amount from the customers I have today? Especially if that rate then goes retroactive and you go back and you go, okay, well, I don't have those customers any longer. How does that how do I work that? And MISO has several charges that also flow through. So I think the retail supplier is looking and going, okay, I've got a group of different aspects that I have to put together in an energy price. But a lot of those are moving parts. And as they move more, there's more risk that's put on the retail supplier to try to determine, well, exactly then how much do I charge, right? And so I think that at times it is hard to get, if not fixed rates, but more consistent rates, if you will. Helps not only the retail suppliers, but I think, again, the end consumers. And so, but it is difficult because there's a lot of things that are pulling in different directions that make that.
Good. Thank you. I think we'll cut it off there. And actually, Ron, your comments tie in well with a couple of wrap-up statements I just wanted to make. And starting out with one thing, GDF Suez prides itself as being transparent to its consumers, and also being educational to make sure that our customers understand what they're buying, what goes into that price, and making sure that they're making an informed decision so that they know if they're comparing our offers to an offer from one of our other competitors, that they're taking everything into account. To Ron's point, there are a lot of charges that go into the retail electric supply beyond distribution, beyond the taxes components. We've got energy, we have capacity, and we talked about capacity today, transmission, both the network integrated transmission charges that pay for the high voltage interstate system, but also some of these ancillary costs that go to balancing the system and keeping it flowing and keeping it operating. Line losses is another area that customers need to be aware of and be mindful of. So a lot of those costs are moving. The energy component is what we can really control as a supplier, and as a customer, because those are areas that we can hedge. We can use other financial tools or generation to be able to lock into a fixed price, or work with our customers to say maybe a fixed price is not the best thing for you. Maybe you want to manage your risk in a little bit different way. Take more of the energy at the hourly price, lock in some of that at different times with different hedging instruments. That's the area that we can control, that energy component. That's the most volatile, but it's the area that we can really manage and help customers risk manage. The other components, and that's a lot of what we've talked about today, are things that are regulated either by Chairman Scott and the ICC or through the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, where we're all price takers on that. The suppliers can't take a position on it. We can't go to a Wall Street bank and hedge transmission. No one's going to take the other side of that hedge. These are tariff costs that are set by regulators, and customers need to be aware just of how those are priced. If you want your supplier to say, yeah, I'll fix those for the next 5 years, well, you're going to pay something for that, because he's taking on risk that can't be mitigated, can't be passed off to another wholesale entity. So that's why we like to bring discussions like this to our customer base, make sure they're aware of what the issues are, where the moving parts are at the moment, and then they can have a more informed discussion with whatever supplier they're talking to about, hey, how are you handling these multi-value transmission projects, or how are you handling my alternative compliance payment on RPS? So you really understand if it's a fixed price, is everything fixed, or are there ways that they're going to come back and say, hey, this went up, so now we're going to charge you a little bit more. So that's why we do this education. We encourage you to talk with the suppliers, make sure you understand what you're getting, and be comparing contracts on an apples-to-apples basis. So appreciate your time today and joining us, and time to go and enjoy the beautiful summer weather finally. So thank you very much. Thank you to our panel.